So today we're meeting with Professor Dan Cartamil, marine biologist at the Scripps Institute of Oceanography and a professor at the University of San Diego, USD. He's an expert on shark biology and I think also stingray biology. So
Yeah, that's right. So
yeah,
thanks. I appreciate being on your podcast.
yeah, thanks for joining us. So I'm curious, what was your initial interest in biology? What first got you passionate about it?
I've been really interested in biology since I was a little kid. Going on vacation near the oceans and seeing the barnacles and all that kind of stuff.
For sure.
And just always been really interested. But when I graduated college, um, I went to college upstate New York. Was all centered around terrestrial ecosystems. I did a biology degree. Um, but I had no idea what I wanted to do. And I went down to Florida just for fun because I had friends that lived there. And a friend of mine suggested that I volunteer at a field station down there, which was called the Bimini Biological Field Station in the Bahamas. And so I had no idea. It just sounded like fun. Sure, I'll volunteer in the Bahamas. And it turned out it was a shark research station. I had no
Oh
idea.
boy,
So suddenly I got there, and the first day we're tracking sharks, and I was just instantly addicted to shark biology, and that was kind of from that point on. That was the path I followed.
that's wild. So pretty early on, you narrowed in on sharks as well, like specifically.
Yeah, but really kind of accidentally in a way. I mean, I was really interested in the marine
Mm,
environment, and it could, if it had been a lobster lab, I probably would have gotten into lobsters, but it happened to be sharks. And
nice.
there's something about these large, beautiful animals that's just addicting to work with because they're so amazing. And there also is kind of an associated adrenaline rush with working with these animals too,
For
you know.
sure. Definitely. Nice. Has your interest pivoted much over the years, or is it still pretty much focused in the same areas?
Um, I guess it's definitely broadened. At first, I was really focused on sharks and cartilaginous fishes in general, which includes stingrays.
Hmm.
So sharks and rays are very closely related. But then I got more interested in kind of like you could apply the same kind of technology, like we were doing a lot of tracking studies where we study the movements of animals, and you apply that same technology to study other fishes, which I've done. So I've studied like the ocean sunfish, for example,
Hmm.
and tunas and various coastal fishes. And on top of that, my research has taken me to a lot of really interesting places. A lot of my work has taken place in Baja California. So from that, I became interested in photography as a conservation tool. And so I've been really spending the last 10, 15 years focusing a lot on photography as well, and bringing to light a lot of Baja California's conservation issues through photography.
For sure. Very cool. I think you've done some research on stingrays specifically as well, yeah?
Yeah, I have done research on stingrays. I've done a lot of work tracking the movements of fish.
Mm.
And so when my first exposure to stingrays was out in Hawaii. We did a project when I was doing my master's degree at Cal State Long Beach. We went out to Hawaii and we were tracking a stingray called the Hawaiian stingray Daisyatus lata. But it's got a stinger about this big.
Oh boy.
And so that was my first exposure to handling stingrays. And what we would used to do was we would put, you would have a life preserver, and we would, the first, as soon as we caught the ray, the first thing we do is squish that life preserver onto its stinger so that it couldn't get you, because those things they can really do some damage.
Hmm.
Um, and so I was tracking those rays. When I did my master's degree at Cal State Long Beach, that's when I really got involved with rays, specifically the round stingray, which is the one we're going to talk about a lot today. They are swarming offshore of Long Beach, specifically places like Seal Beach. And so I did a lot of work looking at kind of the population dynamics of stingrays there, and specifically the issue of whether stingrays, or whether there are certain methods that you can use to reduce the incidence of surfers getting injured by stingrays.
Oh wow. That's perfect. Very cool. So when you are studying stingrays, it sounds like it was a lot of field work. Um, What's a day like going out in the field to work on stingrays?
Yeah, that's a lot of field work. I'm in general a field biologist. I just historically haven't done much work in the lab. We did a little work in the lab with stingrays, but really like a typical like week, I would say, studying stingrays for us would be something like over the weekend, we'd get to a place like Seal Beach very early, and we'd set out um, seine nets, these nets that we would take far offshore with the help of the lifeguards. They would take the nets out on jet skis, and then we'd have like 20 or 30 people pull the nets in, and sometimes hundreds of stingrays would come up at a time. We had all these pools on the beach filled with seawater. We put them all in there and then spend the rest of the day tagging them all. So we'd have all these little tagging stations and putting little visible ID tags in each and collecting lots of other data and then putting them back in the water. So yeah, a lot of just days full of slime and
Very hands-on.
very hands-on. And then during the week, we would catch more stingrays and then we would track them for a different study. So we would actually put radio transmitters. Well, they're called acoustic transmitters, actually. Radio doesn't work underwater. Acoustic is just a little electronic tag that releases an ultrasonic pulse that you can hear with the right equipment. And so if you put one of these little tags on a stingray, you can follow it around the ocean on a boat and figure out where it's going and what habitat it's utilizing. And so we would do that kind of study during the week.
Very cool.
And then the next weekend we'd be studying some other fish,
Yeah,
so
tons of stuff. Wow.
Yeah.
And you mentioned you did study specifically how to avoid basically getting stung by stingrays.
Yeah, well, the impetus for our study was not so much to how to avoid being stung. It was more to see how the public, in general, how maybe we could reduce the incidence of stings in the public. And the reason for this is that, as you well know, like the round stingray is extremely common places like Seal Beach, places where there's warm water, shallow water, not too much wave action. They really like those areas, and those are also some of those areas interact a lot with places where surfers like to be. And so places like Seal Beach, for example, where we were working a lot, there would maybe be 300 people getting stung over the summer surfing season, though the main surfing season, the tourist season.
Yeah.
And then, other people would get stung during the rest of the year too, but mostly over the summer. So you'd get to the beach and you'd see a lifeguard station with 15 people sitting there with their foot in a bucket of hot water, So the idea was like, how could we reduce this? Or is there any way to do it? Like the Seal Beach had proposed already various ways to do this. So one way, for example, was having stingray fishing derbies, where you would go out and kill lots of stingrays, and the town would sponsor it, and presumably that might lower the incidence of injuries. So that's one thing that we were looking into. Is that even, forget the ethics of it, I mean, would that even work?
Would it even help? Yeah.
Another thing that we looked into was cutting the barbs of the stingrays and then re-releasing them. If you could do that, maybe you could just catch them all, cut their barbs. That was another way. So those were the two kind of main things we were looking at in terms of reducing injuries. And what we found was that as far as stingray fishing derbies, where you would kill a lot of stingrays, what we found is that the population is not only enormous, but it's highly mobile. Even though they're small rays, you don't think of them swimming very far. They do, and they move up and down the coast. So even if they're in a certain kind of isolated area, those same rays might not be there in a month. It might be other rays that come and take their place. And so you might wipe them all out in a certain area, and then within a month, they'd be replaced by stingrays from another area. So what we really found through these tagging studies is that that's not going to be a viable option. And then as far as cutting the stingray barbs, what we found was that they replaced them on an annual basis. So typically, if you catch a stingray, it's got a barb. But what we saw is that around June, July, you would start to see a second barb underneath the main barb. And it was really small. It was a little nub. And then that barb would start growing and growing. And maybe around September, October, it would be as long as the main one. And that main one would fall off.
Interesting.
And so it's just an annual replacement, which kind of makes sense because the barbs wear out. And that's kind of their main defense mechanism. So in terms of cutting their barbs, that's not going to work either.
Yeah.
So it turns out that neither of those options was particularly viable for reducing injuries.
For sure. Do you have any advice for how to reduce injuries if you're just like an individual person?
Well, the main advice, I mean, I have. I don't know that I'm really an expert in this area, but you just have to kind of be careful and be aware of your surroundings. I've seen a lot of, probably these are newer surfers, so that are jumping off boards, and I've seen that quite a bit actually. Like people hanging out on board and then sort of jump off the board a little bit, not jump, but just push themselves off and land pretty quickly on the ground, and that's a recipe for getting stung. Stingrays don't want to interact with humans. It's actually pretty dangerous for them as well. So but they're very reactive. If you happen to step on one quickly, it's not even a voluntary thing. It's going to flip up its tail and try and sting you. That's its survival mechanism. So so you'd want to enter very gently and be aware of where you're landing. And of course, you would try and do the Stingray shuffle as much as possible. That's the old classic, right? You just kind of shuffle your feet so that there's some physical force that the stingrays are aware of. They know that you're coming, and then they're happy to get out of the way. And of course, knowing your surroundings also means knowing kind of where, maybe doing a little research about where you're surfing or swimming, and knowing what the area is like in terms of the biological conditions. Places like Seal Beach, for example, the reason there are so many stingrays, or one of the main reasons there's so many stingrays there, is simply because of warm water effluent from the power plants in that area. And so there's this warm water that pools up close to the beach. That warm water we found is actually attractive for not only stingrays, but there's a lot of fish that are attracted to warmer water for various reasons, and could relate to prey density. It could relate to mating activity. It could relate to reproduction. But for various reasons, those kind of specific areas attract a lot of marine life, especially stingrays. Mm-hmm. So you want to know about those things before you go.
For sure. Yeah. In addition to the stingray shuffle, we've also heard of from some people that just testing themselves shuffling, and they didn't see the stingray moved. It's a small data set, but some people said instead of shuffling, they do the Stingray Stomp, where they just like make small stomping motions as they get into the water. And I really don't, I have no data set to back either of them.
I don't either.
But it's funny just hear about these different solutions people have.
I guess, yeah. I mean, they would maybe feel a little bit of a shockwave and get out. Anything that could cause them to, they're pretty sensitive to movement, so anything that could cause them to do that. Yeah, and obviously we make a product to protect surfers from getting stung, to give you some more protection. But using any of these strategies in parallel with some protective product is definitely going to make you more protected than if you're just going in on faith and jumping off your surfboard and potentially landing on one, right? Yeah, and I mean, I've seen a lot of injuries. It's just an extremely common thing. I don't know if we know for sure whether it is that the stingrays are increasing or in number. I mean, a lot of times when you see increases in injuries, it also is a result of increasing human population.
Yeah.
And of course, there's every year there's more people in the water, especially in places like San Diego. But the stings themselves can be fairly traumatic. The stingers are barbed, which means that they've got it's not just the stinger itself, but it has these little barbs that are facing backwards. So when this if you get stung by a stingray, what happens is the barb enters, but then as it comes out, if it comes out, it's the backwards facing barbs are pulling a lot of flesh with it, and so it can result in a really ragged wound. That, in conjunction with the venom that can be transferred during that puncture wound, can be extremely painful. And then there's things like, bacteria in the water that can also cause infections. So one of the reasons that you see a lot of people at lifeguard stations with their feet in buckets of water is because the venom itself is it's a protein based venom. So by putting it in hot water, you can kind of neutralize the venom and it breaks down. So they typically it's recommended that you would put your foot in a bucket of water. It's pretty much as hot as you can stand, maybe 105, 110 degrees. And that seems to help a lot. Yeah. But I mean, obviously, if you had something on your feet that would prevent you from getting, so if you could have something preventative and be aware and, use the proper techniques to avoid getting stung, then that's the best of all worlds.
Yeah, for sure. So I'm curious, you were saying there's maybe more stings nowadays than there were potentially because of population growth of humans or some other interaction. Do you feel that people understand stingrays? Is there some misunderstanding that we most commonly have?
Yeah, I think it probably depends on the person in general. And, the average beachgoer, I feel, maybe misunderstands marine life in general. I mean, obviously, they're not going to be concerned about a Garibaldi or whatever little fish that's swimming around. But when it comes to things like stingrays and sharks, there's a lot of fear and trepidation. Definitely. I've heard. Yeah. I think on the other hand, people that are a little more seasoned ocean goers, surfers a lot specifically, they tend to realize that they're in the habitat of an animal, and it's not that the animal is necessarily trying to interact with humans. They're just reacting to how in their space invaded. And so from that standpoint, I think surfers are pretty much in the know that they just have to be aware of these things. But yeah, a lot of people are really worried about sharks, especially. I hear that all the time. Definitely. And stingrays, they're like, I wish we could just get rid of them all. And they don't realize how important stingrays and sharks and all the fish in the nearshore waters are ecologically.
For sure. I'm curious, as we have like global warming, as ocean temperatures are getting warmer, what sort of impact would you expect to stingrays and maybe to other shore life in general?
Yeah, so that's a good question. Climate change in general is a little tough to gauge with some of the larger critters that are mobile because they can move. So with sharks, for example, it's a little tough to tell. But with things like stingrays, what we're seeing in a lot of places, like right now in Florida, for example, the big thing in the news is you're seeing these really elevated coastal temperatures. And so as we start to see those things play out on the California coast, for example, we already know that places that are very warm tend to be attractive to stingrays. So we might start to see larger areas of stingray abundance in coastal waters in places that we haven't seen them before. We typically would expect to see range extensions, meaning that right now and historically, brown stingrays have been found maybe from Point Conception, so the Santa Barbara area, and down into Baja California. But with increased climate change, warming of the ocean waters, and potentially changes in currents, we could start seeing them farther north. And the other kind of climate change related impact has to do with ocean acidification. So a lot of rays, not necessarily the round stingray, The round stingray tends to feed more on like little crustaceans and fishes and things like that. But a lot of other rays do feed on things that form shells of calcium carbonate, like clams. And if you're feeding on a shell forming organism, the problem is that with ocean acidification, which is essentially the lowering of the pH of the ocean as it absorbs carbon dioxide from the environment, the ocean starts to become a little more acidic, and that makes it much more difficult for these organisms like clams to form their shells. Hence, less clams, less prey for stingrays. So there's all kinds of interacting effects. We're kind of just on the cusp of learning what these effects are and what they're going to be.
Sounds like it's really hard to predict, like on net. There's going to be more stingrays, less stingrays, and
yeah, it's the ocean is an incredibly hard place to predict because it's so dynamic. The web, the food web, so to speak, is really composed of thousands and thousands of interactions, and each of those interactions is interacting with what we call abiotic variables. In other words, things like the temperature and the pH of the water and the currents and all that kind of stuff. So it's a really dynamic environment. It makes it a little difficult to, but broadly speaking, I think we can certainly expect some changes in things like range and perhaps local abundance.
Crazy. Very cool. Well, thank you for taking time to talk with us today. Really appreciate your time today. And also, like, the research you've done is super useful for us. So appreciate all the work you've put in over the years, researching these things, testing these things.
Yeah, thanks. Well, it's been an amazing journey. Studying sharks and rays from Hawaii to Alaska and all over the northern hemisphere. So I love doing it and talking to the public about it.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much.
Yeah, sure.